Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to talk to you this afternoon about this man that I've lived with for the past 10 years, Abraham Lincoln. I must say it was pretty frightening at first to decide to live with him because so many others had done so over the years, more books about Abraham Lincoln than anyone except for Jesus Christ. So I had no idea whether I'd be able to find my own way into the story. But all I knew was that I wanted to spend time with him. I wanted to learn about the Civil War. So it meant having to have sort of a leap of faith that I could come up with some sort of storyline. There was the additional problem, which was that he was so old, and by that I mean that he came from the 19th century, and all the other books I had written had been 20th century books, which meant that I had been able to interview people who knew my subjects. There were still, of course, dozens of people alive who knew Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, had worked for them in the White House. My husband had worked in the Kennedy administration, so he was close to the Kennedy family, and I could interview them from my book on the Kennedys. And with Lyndon Johnson, I'd had the extraordinary experience of having worked for him when I was 24 years old, having been a White House fellow, worked for him in the White House, and then accompanied him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs the last 4 years of his life. So with Abraham Lincoln, there'd be nobody I could talk to who had worked for him, known him, but I found something even more valuable than those personal interviews might have given me, and that was that the people in his generation kept diaries and wrote letters with an art of letter writing that is probably unequaled, certainly in our time today. I think there's nothing for an historian that's more exciting than to read a handwritten entry into a diary written late at night after the war has been fought that day. Seward, his Secretary of State, would go home and write 8-page letters to his wife. In the Seward family archives, there were 5,000 letters between Seward and his family, and all of the characters in his cabinet, Chase and Bates and Wells, kept diaries from the time they were young until months before they died. I wonder what it's going to be like for historians 200 years from now. They'll have so much more stuff about us, but they won't have that intimate detail that comes really from absorbing the daily life of these people when they wrote about it so emotionally so many years ago. So I thought at first when I started this book that I would write about Abe and Mary Lincoln because I'd had the confidence of writing about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. But it turned out that Mary Lincoln couldn't carry the public side of the story the way Eleanor could, who was so involved in the home front that she really was a partner with Lincoln. And the more I got into the story, the more I realized that in many ways Lincoln was spending even more time with these members of his cabinet than he was with Mary, and married to them emotionally in a different way than Mary, too, because they would wait in the telegraph office at night for news from the battlefront. So emotional were those moments of waiting to hear that 5,000 or 10,000 people had died that day. They would often hold hands. They would sleep in the telegraph office waiting for the news. He then traveled with these characters in his cabinet to the battlefront. He relaxed with them in carriage rides in the afternoon, went to the theater with them. So in the end, I began to think, these are the people that I really want to write about. And then when it turned out that they, unlike Lincoln, had this incredible group of letters and diaries, finally, about 2 years into the 10-year process, I knew this was the story that I wanted to tell. And then it got even more exciting when I realized that these people had been his rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860. Seward, Bates, and Chase, each one of whom thought he should have been president instead of Abraham Lincoln, each one better educated, more experienced, far more better known than Lincoln, and yet he put them into his cabinet, making really the most unusual cabinet in presidential history. It took a lot of self-confidence to do this, because everybody thought he'll just be a figurehead, the whole thing will explode in his midst. But somehow he knew himself well enough to know that if he surrounded himself with strong people, it would be to his benefit and to the benefit of the country. And what was so exciting about these last 10 years is that I knew when I started the process of studying Lincoln that I respected him enormously, but I had no idea of the affection that I would feel for him, nor did I expect to find what an affable, wonderfully live personality he was. We've seen those pictures of him for so long where he's got that long face and that unfortunate beard that I wish he had never grown, and he seems to be so sad all the time. And there was a truth that he had been born, I suspect, with a melancholy temperament. And yet I think we've overdone the idea of him as a depressed figure all his life. I think part of that depression came when he was young, worried about knowing that he had talents and wondering whether he would ever be able to realize them. But once he got to the presidency, knowing that he was on this large stage and had a chance to make things different for people, there's very little evidence that he ever took to his bed in the darkest days of the war. On the contrary, he was the one who sustained everybody else's spirits with his wonderful ability to tell stories, which I think had gone way back into his early adulthood. When he was a young lawyer on the circuit in Illinois, all the judges and the lawyers used to travel together, and when anybody knew that Lincoln was in town in a particular boarding house on a village square, they would come from miles around to hear him tell stories hour after hour. He was so entertaining. And the stories are not quite what you might expect from our marble monument. One of his favorite stories had to do with Ethan Allen, the Revolutionary War hero, who went to London, according to Lincoln's story, after the Revolution. And the British people were still upset about losing the Revolution. So they decided they'd embarrass him a little bit by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in an outhouse where he would have to encounter it at some point in his trip. And they figured he'd be upset about the undignified place of George Washington in some place like an outhouse. But he came out of the outhouse smiling, not upset at all. So they said, "Well, didn't you see George Washington there?" "Oh, yes," he said. "I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him." "What do you mean?" they said disconcertingly. "Well," he said, "there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington." And the amazing thing is that Abraham Lincoln had hundreds of stories in similar vein. So you can imagine that when I woke up in the morning, I couldn't wait to read one of these stories and find myself laughing out loud in my own study. I believe early on Lincoln was aware that he possessed unusual talents. He was burning with a desire to learn in a frontier environment that didn't really give much credit to reading or writing. As a result, he had to scour the countryside for books, and he was so excited, they said, when he laid his hands on the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, or one of Shakespeare's plays, that he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. He finally calculated that because he only could go to school a few weeks here, a few weeks there, that he had only gone to school 1 year of formal schooling. But the books that he so loved became his education, and literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings. The great poet Emily Dickinson once said, "There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away." How true for Lincoln. Though he never would travel to Europe, he went with Shakespeare's kings to England, he went with Lord Byron's poetry to Spain and Portugal. Literature allowed him to transcend, as I say, his surroundings. Over and over again, that's the theme in many ways of his life. But there were so many losses in his early life that he became haunted by death. His mother died when he was only 9 years old. His beloved only sister, Sarah, died in childbirth a few years later. And his first love, Anne Rutledge, died at the age of 22. Moreover, when his mother lay dying, she didn't open out for him the promise that they would meet in another world, in an afterlife. Death was so common in that time that deathbed scenes often talked about meeting siblings who had passed before, meeting you when you came. But she simply said to him, "Abraham, I'm going away from you now, and I shall never return." As a result, he became haunted by the thought that when you die, dust becomes dust, that your earthly existence comes to an end. And only as he grew older did he seem to get some solace through his reading of what seems to be an old Greek notion that there was a way you could outlive your earthly existence, and that was if you accomplished something so worthy that your reputation would go on after you die, your story would be told. That worthy ambition in him became so large, much larger than celebrity, power, fame, or office. It became, as he himself said, the desire to somehow leave the world a little better place for his having lived in it. And I became convinced that that worthy ambition became his lodestar. It carried him through that difficult childhood and young adulthood when he had to work all day as a surveyor or a clerk while he was studying law at night. It carried him through the one significant depression that he did have in his early 30s. 3 things had combined to lay him low. He had broken his engagement with Mary Todd Lincoln, not certain he was ready to be married, but knowing how much it hurt her by doing so. His one great intimate friend, Joshua Speed, was leaving Illinois to go back to Kentucky because his father had died. And his political career in the state legislature was on a downward slide. He was so depressed that he said he was the most miserable man in the world. And he knew that he had to get better, he said, or he would die. His friends worried that he was suicidal, taking all knives and razors and scissors from his room. And his best friend, Joshua Speed, came to his side and said, "Lincoln, you must rally or you will die." He said then, "I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet done anything to make any human being remember that I have lived." And then somehow that desire, that ambition got him out of that depression, back into the state legislature. Eventually he ran for a seat in the Congress, won a single term, lost popularity by questioning the rationale for the Mexican-American War, arguing that the president had started the war for his own purposes rather than the stated reasons, but no echo to the present whatsoever. But nonetheless, he then tried twice to run for the U.S. Senate, lost twice. Somebody else might have said, "Lincoln, it's time for you to go on to another profession." But somehow he showed one of those qualities that would prove ever present in his long career, and that was the ability to motivate himself in the face of frustration, to analyze and learn for the reasons from his mistakes and his successive failures, and to move forward to an even bigger goal, the nomination for the presidency on the Republican ticket in 1860. Now, everyone expected Seward, the governor and senator from New York, the most celebrated anti-slavery orator of the decade, to win. If not Seward, they thought it would be Chase, the governor and senator from Ohio, and if not Chase, Bates, the elder statesman from Missouri. But as it turned out, despite the thinness of Lincoln's resume in contrast to these other three rivals, which consisted at that point of only that single term in Congress served a dozen years earlier, he possessed an unparalleled array of emotional skills that proved far more important than his external resume. Indeed, I think temperament may be what we should look for in our political candidates. Their emotional, their political qualities may be far more important than how long they've actually stayed in a particular office without showing these qualities. For example, he was determined from the start in the months prior to the convention not to disparage any of his other rivals. Well, they were all busy attacking one another. He worked harder than all the others combined. Seward was so sure he would win that nomination that he actually went to Europe for 9 months right prior to the convention, where he dined with kings and queens who thought they were meeting the next president of the United States, while Lincoln went from one state to the other, delivering his speeches, which grew incrementally in power and power. Indeed, his speeches had a different tone from all of his rivals. While all the other anti-slavery orators were busy castigating the Southerners as evil, unchristian men, he simply said they are what we would be in their situation. If the South no longer had slavery, they would not introduce it. If we in the North still had slavery, we would not know how to get rid of it instantly. I cannot judge them for not doing what I myself would not know how to do. And because these speeches showed, I think, another deep quality in him, which was the ability to see things from everybody else's point of view, an extraordinary empathy that would be his prize. But most importantly, because of that empathy, he had not made enemies along the way. Whereas each of his rivals had made enemies that were permanent, Lincoln somehow was able to turn his former opponents into allies, shake off feelings of jealousy or envy when he lost those races, and make those people into his great supporters when he ran for the presidency. And he developed the best strategy of all of his rivals. He told all the delegates, "I know I'm not your first love, but if you can't have your first love, come to me as your second love." A very humble thing to do. And so when none of the other front runners were able to achieve a majority on the first ballot, and the delegates were figuring out, where do we go from here, they all turned to Lincoln because he was the only one who hadn't hurt their man. So he stunned the convention by winning that nomination, and then stunned the nation even more when the Democratic Party split apart by winning the general election. And then the morning after his victory, he made that decision that would define his presidency, to put all three of these rivals into his cabinet. A less confident man might have surrounded himself with personal supporters who would never have questioned him. Lincoln was asked, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "It's simple. These are the strongest and most able men in the country. The country is in peril. I cannot deprive the country of their services." But my old friend Lyndon Johnson might have put it somewhat more crudely: better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in at you. I think Lincoln put it a little bit more diplomatically. Now, to be sure, Seward, Chase, and Bates were indeed all strong and able men. But in the end, it was the prairie lawyer from Illinois who would prove the master of them all, as he brought all of these remarkable men to their best service in their entire life. Winning over Seward was his most remarkable achievement. To lose that nomination for Seward was an irrecoverable blow. 10,000 people waited outside his home in Auburn, New York to celebrate. The champagne was already there to be uncorked, something one should never do until the victory is actually won. I remember in 1986, as a Red Sox fans, we had uncorked the champagne before the ball went through Bill Buckner's legs. A very big mistake. So, too, they were ready with the champagne in Auburn, New York, and they never needed to use it. He said when he went around his hometown the next day, he felt like he was hearing his obituary as everybody said his career was over. But then Lincoln offered him that most powerful post of Secretary of State. He agreed, thinking, I'll be a prime minister. Lincoln will simply be a figurehead. But Seward was the first, within months of getting into that office, to realize that with Lincoln, it was like nobody he had ever known before. He recognized his qualities so much that he gave up his own desire to run 4 years later if he had had that chance, decided to settle in to become Lincoln's advisor, his partner, and indeed his most intimate friend. They shared many qualities. They both loved telling stories. They both had a great sense of humor. They both loved history. They loved novels. They loved the theater. Lincoln loved nothing more than to go to Seward's house at Lafayette Park across from the White House, put his big legs up on a chair, and they would talk about everything else except for the war. Seward reminded me in many ways of Churchill. He loved to drink all night long. He loved his cigars all day long, and yet managed to get up in the morning to work in the State Department. And so Lincoln spent those hours, so importantly, being able to relax and replenish his energies with his great friend, William Henry Seward. Now, Chase, who becomes his Secretary of the Treasury, had the opposite personality to Seward. He was very stiff, deeply religious. He thought alcohol was evil. He thought novels were a waste of time. He thought theater was sinful. He spent his evenings writing in his diary, reading the Bible, or practicing jokes, but unfortunately he could never remember the punchline of the jokes. He had a relentless drive to be president, which started from the time he was 18 and never ended until months before he died. I think in some ways that drive destroyed his life because he had such an honorable life. He was the attorney general, they said, for runaway slaves when he was a lawyer, an honorable abolitionist, governor and senator from Ohio, a great Secretary of the Treasury, but felt his life was a failure because he never reached the presidency. I think in some ways that relentless drive came from a terrible void in his private life. He had married 3 young women, all of whom died young. The first one he loved passionately died in childbirth at 22 years old. The second one at 25 of tuberculosis, and the third in her early 30s of tuberculosis, and he never married again. As a result, everything was poured into his political career, and he never did stop trying. Even in 1864, while he's still in the Treasury, he's trying to use the Treasury to organize his own campaign against Lincoln, hoping to wrest the Republican nomination from Lincoln in that second term. Lincoln knew everything Chase was doing. He was always up on the gossip in the town. He loved to talk to newspapermen. He loved to talk to young congressmen. He knew that Chase was trying to disparage him. He knew all the terrible things Chase was saying about him, but he kept him in that job. And his friends said, how come you're doing this? But Lincoln said he's doing a terrific job raising the funds, getting the taxes, getting the loans necessary to keep the troops on the field, far more important than my personal feelings toward him. He eventually outmaneuvered Chase, of course, wins the nomination himself, wins the election in 1864 for the second term, and then, incredibly, a position arises for Chief Justice in the Supreme Court, and he appoints Salmon Chase to that most powerful post. And again, his friends come to him and said, Lincoln, how can you do this? Don't you know the horrible things he's been saying about you these years? Lincoln said, I know worse things that Chase has said about me than any of you do. And actually, on a personal basis, I'd rather swallow a buckhorn chair than appoint Chase to this position. But he will be the best man for the rights of the emancipated slaves. And that's far more important than our personal relationship. And it turned out to be true. He did indeed guarantee what was necessary for the freed slaves, just as Lincoln hoped he would. Now, Bates, who becomes his attorney general, the arc of his life was almost the opposite to Chase's, because he, too, like Chase, was very ambitious when he was young. He was in the Missouri State Constitutional Convention, was a young state legislature, a very young congressman, but then he fell so deeply in love with his wife, Julia, that he couldn't bear being away from her. He said when he was on his way to Congress that he felt this restless, indefinable feeling away from her. He could get through the days okay, but he couldn't bear the nights away from her. So eventually he didn't run for Congress again. He was turning down various cabinet posts. He just wanted to spend the nights with his Julia. Well, he must have spent a few of these nights with Julia because they ended up having 17 children. So somehow he managed to be with his Julia. He agreed to run for the presidency in 1860 only because the country was split in two, and they thought he, as a border state man, might hold it together, and then agreed to run and become Lincoln's Attorney General. At the beginning, he thought Lincoln was rather unexceptional, but at the end, as he watched Lincoln dealing with these complex human relationships inside his official family, recognized Lincoln's ability to listen to all sides of an issue before deciding and then bring the team together once he had decided, then he finally concluded that Lincoln was as near a perfect man as anyone he had ever met. Now, the most remarkable transformation of attitudes toward Lincoln, however, occurred with Stanton, who became his Secretary of War. They had met as young lawyers in the 1850s. Stanton was nationally known lawyer from Ohio, Lincoln known only in Illinois. Stanton had a hugely lucrative patent case that was going to be tried in Illinois, so the partner thought, maybe we need somebody who knows the judges in Illinois. Somebody interviewed Lincoln, thought he'd be okay for the case. Lincoln was so excited it would be the first time he could work with such an important lawyer. He worked all summer on his brief. But then at the end of the summer, the case got transferred from Illinois back to Ohio, so they didn't need Lincoln anymore, but they forgot to tell him. So he kept working on his brief. He went all on his own to Cincinnati, and he went right up to Stanton in a typically affable Lincoln way and said, "Let's go up to the courthouse together in a gang." It is said and was recorded at the time that Lincoln took one look at Stanton took one look at Lincoln, and he had a big stain on his shirt. His trousers were too short for his long legs. His hair was disheveled. And he turned to his partner and he said, "We've got to lose this long-armed ape. He will hurt our case." They turned their back on him. They never opened the brief he had so painstakingly prepared. They didn't let him sit with him in the boarding house. And when Lincoln left Cincinnati, he said he was so humiliated that he never wanted to go back to that city again. And yet, almost unimaginably, 6 years later, when he's president, and his first Secretary of War, Cameron, resigns, everybody comes to him and said, "Stanton's the man for the job. He's brilliant, he's hardworking, he's stubborn, he's tough on subordinates, but he'll be able to get that sleepy War Department into shape." And Lincoln somehow was able to put this past hurt behind him, not feel the need to retaliate, not feel the need to hold that grudge any longer, and gave Stanton that most powerful civilian post. And in the end, Stanton ended up concluding that he loved Lincoln more than anyone outside of his family. So what were the leadership qualities that enabled Lincoln to really master all of these remarkable men? First and foremost, I would argue, it was the quiet self-confidence that allowed him to bring them all into his official family in the first place. And secondly, that ability that he had to read the emotions of others, to empathize with their needs for recognition and approval and special relationships with him. He would constantly share credit for success whenever it was to be had with each one of them, writing them personal letters. Harry Truman once said, "You can accomplish anything in life so long as you don't care who gets the credit." And Lincoln understood that instinctively. But even more striking was his ability to not only share credit for success, but to shoulder responsibility for failure. When his first Secretary of War, Cameron, was about to be censured by the Congress for having let contracts to middlemen in the early days of the war, for having let contracts to, he gave money to these middlemen. They gave out contracts to suppliers who then produced weapons that didn't work, horses that were blind, knapsacks that fell apart in the rain. They made money and the weapons were terrible. And they blamed Cameron for these contracts. Cameron felt not only was his career coming to an end with his censure, but that his family would be stigmatized forever. At that low moment, Lincoln stood up for him. He wrote a letter to the Congress saying, "If anyone's to blame for these unfortunate contracts, it is me and the entire cabinet." He then described the chaos of the early days of the war when they had to move an army that had been 50,000 men to get several million men supplied and clothed, and mistakes were made. Cameron later said no one else would have stood up for him at such a moment, and he learned then what Seward had learned several months earlier, that Lincoln was unlike anyone he had ever met. Now, that ability of Lincoln's to acknowledge error on his own part meant that he could learn from mistakes. When he had to change his mind on something, it was very simple for him, unlike most of our politicians today who seem, if they do show a shift in something, to have to pretend they're really saying the same thing they ever said 3 years ago, 10 years ago. He simply said, "Yes, I've changed my mind. I'd like to believe I'm smarter today than I was yesterday." The simplicity of the way he dealt with human beings and with himself is what made this all possible. He also recognized his own weaknesses so that he could compensate for them. He knew he had a tendency to give everyone a second chance and then a third chance, which worked not too well with General McClellan. He overvalued General McClellan's ability early in the war to organize and discipline the troops, to make the troops love him. But then he began to see that McClellan had created a beautiful army, but as Lincoln finally quipped, it was a stationary army. He never took it into battle. And so he finally kept giving him these chances to do it, and then realizing that it wasn't going to keep going on endlessly like that, he finally made himself a bargain. He said, "I pledge myself today and to my maker that if McClellan doesn't move the troops in a month's time, I will fire him." He did not move the troops. He finally fired him, and after a few more bad generals, he finally got Ulysses S. Grant. Then when he was angry, he had this fabulous capacity to figure out how to cool down his emotions. He would write what he called a hot letter to the person he was angry with, and then put it aside, hoping that his emotions would cool and he'd never need to send it. The most extraordinary case of that is after General Meade failed to follow up with General Lee's army after Gettysburg. He wrote him a long letter saying, "I'm immeasurably distressed that you didn't do this. Had you done so, the war might have come to an earlier end. But as it is now, it will go on month after month, year after year." Then, knowing how much it would hurt General Meade, he put it aside, and it was never even discovered until decades later when Lincoln's papers were opened, and there was a notation on the bottom, "Never sent, never signed." To be sure, there were times when he did lose his temper, but then somehow he would promptly follow up with a kind gesture. He wrote one general, he said, if I was in error, if I had a temper toward you the other day, I acknowledge my error. And don't worry, I don't have sufficient time to keep up my temper when I get it up." He also knew, as I said earlier, how to relax and distract himself from the pressures of the day. Not only by going to the theater, which he did 100 times during his presidency. He said at night, when Shakespeare's plays would come down and the darkness would descend on the theater, he somehow felt he was catapulted back to another age and another time, and he could forget what was happening in the war. But he would read these humorous stories to his cabinet before those cabinet meetings and tell one of his thousands of stories. He also was able to just have this self-deprecating sense of humor that would just sort of take the sting out of an encounter. One woman came up to him at one point and said, "I think you're very two-faced." And he said to the woman, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" How can you get mad at somebody like that? And he had what I think all great leaders have to have, which is the ability to bounce back from setbacks, to shake off anxiety. After each tough battle was fought, his immediate instinct was to go to the battlefront, the active battlefront, the very next morning. He went a dozen times to the active battlefront during his Civil War days. He wanted to walk amidst the thinning ranks of the soldiers, to visit the wounded in the hospital, to tell his stories to the soldiers that they could then tell to 100 more. He somehow knew it would bolster their morale and bolster his own morale by so doing. Nor did he ever forget the people that he was serving. No, the White House in those days was so much more open than it is today. If you wanted a job, you could simply line up outside of Lincoln's office, go right into the White House, and tell him, after waiting in line, getting into his office, why your particular family needed this postmastership or this clerkship. Tell him the reasons why you had to have it. His secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, would despair at the hours Lincoln was taking with these ordinary people. He said, "You're wrong. These are my public opinion baths. I must never forget the popular assemblage from which I have come." And then he had these huge public receptions at the White House where anybody could come. Backwoodsmen with muddy boots would be standing side by side with diplomats. There was some sacrifice to these big public receptions, which is that people tended to take away parts of the rugs, parts of the draperies, but nonetheless it served Lincoln's purposes because he shook every single person's hand. The most dramatic moment of that was on January 1st, 1863. He had a big New Year's reception that morning, had shaken 1,000 hands, and that afternoon he was set to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But when he went to sign the proclamation, his own hand was numb and shaking. So he put the pen down. He said, "If ever my soul were in an act, it is in this act. But if I sign with a shaken hand, posterity will say he hesitated." So he waited, put the pen down until he could finally pick it up again with a bold, clear signature. And not long after that, his great friend Joshua Speed came to visit him in the White House, and Lincoln reminded him of that conversation they'd had when he was in the midst of his Great Depression so many years before. And pointing to the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said, "Perhaps with this measure, my fondest wish will be realized. I might be remembered." Now, these public opinion baths allowed him, I believe, to feel the currents and the mood of the country as a whole so that he could become a master of timing. He once said if he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation 6 months earlier, he would have lost the border states. If he had waited 6 months more, he would have lost the morale boost that it provided. He knew when to speak to the country, when to issue one of his great public letters, and of course there was the unparalleled beauty of his language. It almost seemed as if the rhythms of the Bible and Shakespeare and the poetry he so loved as a child had worked their way into his very soul, allowing him to give voice to the people's deepest needs. Nowhere more beautifully, I think, than at the second inaugural. Here the North is at the verge of winning this long civil war, but no triumphal message does he deliver. On the contrary, he suggests that the sin of slavery was shared by both sides. Both sides, he said, read the same Bible. Both prayed to the same God. Neither's prayers were fully answered. And then, of course, the words we all remember, with malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. Well, it was only 6 weeks later that his life would come to an end. On that last afternoon of his life, he took Mary on a carriage ride with him. They'd had such a difficult time during the war years, though I'm convinced that when they first met, they were well suited. She loved poetry, politics. She was a great conversationalist. When he met her on her sister's house, the mansion on the hill in Springfield, she was surrounded by beaux, greatly conversationalist. He went right up to her and he said, "Mary, I want to dance with you in the very worst way." After they danced, quite awkwardly, she finally said, he did dance in the very worst way. But nonetheless, she stood by him during all those failures in his early life, believing in his destiny. But once they got to the White House, there was no footing on which she could stand. She had 4 half-brothers who were in the Confederate Army, so the Northerners didn't trust her. The Southerners, of course, didn't trust her married to Lincoln. The Easterners looked down on her because she was a Westerner. And then when her son Willie, 10 years old, her favorite child, died in February of 1862, she lost her bearings in many ways. 4 children in the family, one at Harvard, one had died earlier at 3 years old, and the 2 little boys, 10 and 8, Willie and Tad, were the love and the life of the White House. Tad had a speech defect so that he couldn't really speak in a way that anyone outside the family would understand. Willie was the one who protected him. He had all of Lincoln's qualities. When Willie died, she took to her bed, and Lincoln had to become both mother and father to that little child. But on this last afternoon, he said to her, "Mary, we've been so sad for so long between the war and Willie's death. We've got to try to look forward to life again." They began to talk about where they might want to go after the presidency was over. He wanted to go over the Rockies to California. She wanted to go to Europe. They both wanted to go to the Holy Land, which made the events of that night even harder to accept, knowing that maybe they could have regained some of the spark of their earlier married days. I had not fully absorbed until I got into this project the full extent of the plot that John Wilkes Booth had planned for that evening. For not only was he planning to kill Lincoln, but he had 2 co-assassins, the second one assigned to kill Andrew Johnson, the vice president, and the third one, William Seward, the Secretary of State. The man who was to kill Andrew Johnson went to the hotel where he was staying, had a plan to go right into his hotel room, revolver right in front of him, kill him. Luckily for Andrew Johnson, he went to the bar before he carried out his assignment, had much too much to drink, got cowardly, and left without completing his assignment. But the man who was assigned to kill Seward left a bloody massacre in Seward's house. Unimaginably, there were a dozen people, as always, in Seward's big, warm house. Seward had been in a carriage accident the week before, had had his jaw broken, and was up in his bedroom. The assassin came in pretending to be bringing medicine for Seward, got somehow to the second-floor landing right outside the bedroom when he encountered Seward's son, who said his father was sleeping. He wouldn't let him in, so he took his revolver, hit the son with such force in the skull that the brain was exposed and the son fell into a coma. He then ran into the bedroom with a huge Bowie knife, slashed Seward's other son, slashed the soldier nurse who was taking care of Seward, got to Seward's bedside, slashed his face with such force that his entire cheek was torn off. But fortunately, though he lost a lot of blood and was scarred for the rest of his life, because of the way the jaw was wired, the knife missed the jugular vein, and eventually, months later, he was able to recover. Not so, of course, for Lincoln, for John Wilkes Booth, coming in the back of the president's box with complete access to the theater because he was a well-known actor, shot him in the back of the head with a wound so devastating that the doctor said he should have died instantly. But he held on until 7:22 a.m. the following morning, when Stanton then uttered the words that have come down through the generations, "Now he belongs to the ages." Moreover, as time went by, his reputation only continued to spread. As a remarkable interview with Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, in a New York newspaper in 1908 would testify. Tolstoy's told this stunning story of having gone several years prior to that to a remote area of the Caucasus where there were a group of wild barbarians who had never left this remote part of Russia. And he said, they asked me to tell stories of all the great men of history, so I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great, and they loved it. But the chief stood up before I was finished, and he said, "But wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with a voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America, which is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln." Tolstoy said he told him everything he could about his childhood up to his political career and the Emancipation Proclamation. And then in the interview, he questioned, why was Lincoln so great? Not as great a general as Napoleon, not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great. But Tolstoy concluded, and generations of historians would agree, his greatness consisted in the integrity of his character and the moral fiber of his being. So that dream that had powered Lincoln all through his life, that dream to be remembered, had been realized in ways he never, ever could have imagined. That dream that had carried him through his bleak childhood, his laborious efforts to educate himself, his string of political failures, and the darkest days of the war, his story would be told. Now, for most of us, the chance to have our story told after we die will not be realized through marble monuments in Washington, but rather through the memories of our families, our children, our friends, and our colleagues. Which brings me back at the end to where my love of history really began, to the days when I was only 6 years old, and my father taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to baseball games so that I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And when he came home at night, I now realized that I, in excruciating detail, recounted every single play of every inning of the game that had just taken place that afternoon, but he made me feel I was telling him a fabulous piece of history, even if it was just the history of an afternoon game. And it made me think there was something magic about history propelling me on my lifelong career. And though my father died of a sudden heart attack when I was still in my 20s, before I was married and had my 3 sons, I have passed his memory as well as his love of baseball onto my boys, even though when the Dodgers left Brooklyn, I left the Dodgers, moved to Boston, and became an irrational Red Sox fan. And I must say, when I sit with my boys now at Fenway Park with our season tickets, there are times when I can close my eyes against the sun and imagine myself a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below. Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snider, Carl Furillo, Gil Hodges. I must say there is magic in these moments. When I open my eyes and I see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel an almost invisible loyalty and love, linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never had a chance to see, but whose heart and soul they have come to know through all the stories I have told, which is why in the end I shall always be grateful for this love of history, allowing me to spend a lifetime looking back into the past, allowing me to believe that the private people we have loved and lost in our families and the public figures we have respected in our history, just as Abraham Lincoln wanted to believe, really can live on, so long as we pledge to tell and to retell the stories of their lives. Thank you for letting me do that with you today. Thank you.